On behalf of the Acton 250 Committee, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the last talk before we celebrate the events of April 19th, 1775. In a few moments, we will welcome back John L. Bell, who visited us last April to share the provincial's effort to amass an artillery force in anticipation of a seemingly inevitable engagement with the British Army encamped in Boston. Since then, some of our attendees have had a chance to see and even to fire one of those artillery pieces. But first, let's set the stage for the evening. For a year and a half, we have focused on what noted historian Mary Beth Norton calls the long year of 1774, from the Boston Tea Party, known at the time as the destruction of the tea, to the first shots on April morn, which we all know occurred first in Lexington, and then on to Concord. The Acton 250 Committee has appreciated the opportunity to build partnerships, which we hope will endure with the Acton Historical Society, Ironwork Farm, Acton's Public Libraries, the Acton Lions Club, Freedom's Way, and most recently, the Senior Center. Let me point out representatives of each who are here this evening. Bill Clower, are you right there? So perhaps when the evening is over, you might ask a question of him, how to join the Historic Society, or if there's just a curiosity. Ann Forbes is in the back. Ann, if you raise your hand, please. All right. Public libraries, a question I might ask is, has everybody been to the second floor? If it's been a long time, maybe it's time to go again in anticipation of April 19th and see the extraordinary collection we have of memorabilia from that day. Acton's Lions Club has provided support. Freedom's Way, which supports Minuteman National Park, has been in contact and helpful with publicity. And the Senior Center hosted a dinner, which I heard this evening was very good, yeah? And is Larry Kerpelman here by any chance? He will be giving a talk on May 1st about the spreading of the word after Concord and Lexington at the Senior Center, May 1st. As many of us know all too well, building community without a print newspaper is difficult. The Acton Exchange has stepped into the breach to help publicize and report on the activities leading up to next month. Back now to our countdown. Remember the lag time from the destruction of the tea in December of 73 to the arrival of the official word of the Crown's response, almost half a year. And when it arrived, it was so much worse than generally anticipated, starting with the closure of the Port of Boston. Professor Bob Allison explained the impact of the Massachusetts Government and Judiciary Acts, abrogating the rights granted in the Charter of 1691 to towns to call their own town meetings and ceding judicial power in the colony, not in London. The colonists, whose life were focused locally, quickly responded by recessing meetings and minimizing documentation, as explained by Mary Feuer to us. Extra legal bodies began to form, including the Provincial Congress, described by Bob Gross, held in Concord in the fall of 74. John Adams is often noted for his quote, "The revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people." Our speakers have done a wonderful job of bringing us an understanding that a fundamental change took place before the first shots. Using our imagination and forgetting what we know will soon happen, let's try to imagine the New England winter of 1774-75. For a little context for our students located over there, and thank you for coming. Try to imagine Hayward Road as you drive in and out, or will soon drive in and out, without asphalt during snow, and worse, in early spring rains. Parliament has prohibited the import of armaments, and so the colonists are gathering what they have and pilfering from the British troops what they can. What a perfect time to focus on the web of spies in the colonies. Now that I have your attention, let's clarify how our Acton will celebrate Patriots' Day this year and spread the word. Everyone 21 and over is invited to a celebration of the Acton Minutemen on Wednesday, April 16th at the Discovery Museum from 6 o'clock until a little bit after 8. Traditional outdoor activities will take place with the 6:30 a.m. March to Concord. However, there will be no reenactment. The Robins Ride will occur at 5 p.m. that evening. Please visit the Acton 250 events website to review this sequence and specifics plus Acton 250 merchandise. It is the intention of the Acton 250 History Subcommittee to continue to present speakers to help us grasp the experiences of our Acton forebears immediately after April 19th through to the Declaration of Independence. Look for Beyond the Bridge updates after the 19th. It is now my great pleasure to again introduce John L. Bell, author of The Road to Concord, How 4 Stolen Cannon Ignited the Revolutionary War. He maintains the Boston1775.net website dedicated to a deeper understanding of the start of the American Revolution in New England. His many other historical writings will surely serve as a basis this evening for sharing a grasp of the network of spies of 1775. A Q&A will follow his talk, and you will have an opportunity to purchase his book. May I hear a warm welcome for John L. Bell. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to everybody on the Acton 250 committee. Thank you all for coming out. I also appreciate having been invited back because this is, as we were talking about, my second talk. My previous one was about the story of General Thomas Gage sending soldiers out into the countryside 250 years ago next month. Why did he do that? And that story involves covert operations. It involves provincial sneaking cannon out from under Redcoat Guard. It involves spies, British agents, officers in civilian garb going out to Concord to hunt down those weapons. But those weren't the only spies active at the start of the Revolutionary War. Both sides, of course, wanted to gather useful intelligence about the other side, and both sides wanted to protect their own secrets from the other side. Tonight, I'll talk about a lot more people involved in spying. I don't have a single long story to tell. Instead, I'll tell a bunch of separate, sometimes overlapping or interlocking stories to show the complexity of the occupation and siege of Boston and how so many different people, so many different types of people got involved in the hunt for information. And I'll start with a face that's probably familiar to you, although that's not what it looks like. Let's see. There we go. Doesn't that look familiar? In 1798, Paul Revere told the Reverend Jeremy Belknap, founder of the Massachusetts Historical Society, in the fall of 1774 and winter of 1775, I was upwards of 30 chiefly mechanics who formed ourselves into a committee for the purpose of watching the movements of the British soldiers and getting every intelligence of the movements of the Tories. We held our meetings in the Green Dragon Tavern. That was a tavern in Boston's North End, which was owned by Revere's Masonic Lodge. We were so careful, he said, that our meetings should be kept secret, that every time we met, every person swore on the Bible that they would not discover any of our transactions, but to Messrs. John Hancock, Samuel Adams, Doctors Joseph Warren and Benjamin Church, and one or two more. About November, when things began to grow serious, a gentleman who had connections with the Tory party but was a Whig at heart acquainted me that our meetings were discovered and mentioned the identical words that were spoken among us the night before. We supposed it must be someone among us. We removed to another place, which we thought more secure. But here we found that all our transactions were communicated to General Gage. This came to me through the then Secretary Flucker. He told it to the gentleman mentioned above. So Revere was spying on the British Army and the Loyalists. A double agent on his side was spying on his group, and someone connected with the royal government was leaking that information back to Revere. By the time he wrote this letter, Revere had learned who was sending information to Governor Gage, and I'll come back to that question later. But for the man who was warning Revere that he was being spied upon, Revere obviously knew that person's identity, and he chose to keep it secret. But he left 3 clues to that person's identity. First, the man had heard this information from Thomas Flucker, the Secretary of the Province of Massachusetts, the number 3 man in the royal government. So obviously Flucker trusted that man with sensitive information. Second, the source was a gentleman with connections to the Tory party, but he was a Whig at heart. He secretly supported the Patriot resistance despite being linked to the Loyalists. His political connections had to be secret for Flucker to trust him. And finally, Revere still wanted, in 1798, to preserve that man's reputation, even more than 20 years after these events he was describing. And I think the person who best fits that profile is Henry Knox, later the general in charge of the Continental Artillery. In 1774, Henry Knox was a young bookseller, and Thomas Flucker's daughter, Lucy, married him on June 23rd. So Henry was a member of the Flucker family. But was Henry a secret Whig? Knox's biographers in the late 19th century said that he was an open Whig. He had an uncommon zeal in the cause of liberty, one author wrote. He was thoroughly identified with the ardent Sons of Liberty, wrote another. But none of those authors could offer any evidence for Henry Knox being a political activist. His name doesn't appear on any of the lists of major Whig groups or gatherings. Instead, documents from the late 1774 and early 1775, after Henry and Lucy Knox got married, show people assuming that he would be friendly to the royal government from now on. James Rivington, a newspaper printer in New York, wrote to say that he was recommending Knox's London bookstore to all the officers of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. Rivington also sent 4 chests of tea to Henry Knox to sell in 1774 after the entire Boston Patriot community was trying to boycott tea for months. And he offered to send Henry Knox Loyalist pamphlets to sell. A man named Lieutenant Henry Berry of the 52nd Regiment thought Knox might publish his own political essays. And Knox declined, but he gave a non-political reason for that decision, saying he didn't publish anything political. In Knox's surviving correspondence, he tended to write about the political troubles from a perspective of what was good business, not what was good politics. Only to a very close friend did he show that he was indeed a Whig at heart. That left Knox, I believe, with a public profile of a man who was moderate or neutral, but whose strongest connections and whose best career prospects were on the side of the royal government. Because of Knox's political profile, as I say, of this moderate or neutral, his London bookstore could become a place where genteel people, especially British Army and Navy officers, could meet. It became thus a place where a man might be able to gather useful information. And on January 3rd, 1775, Josiah Quincy Sr. of Braintree wrote to one of his sons with sensitive news. Mr. W. brings intelligence from Boston that the seamen on board the fleet are grown mutinous, that one of the Navy officers, meeting with a land officer at K-X's shop, who could that be? K-X's shop, told him that on board all the ships their men were grown so uneasy and tumultuous that it was with great difficulty they could govern them. So we actually have a primary source about Knox's shop being a source of intelligence, and the fact that Quincy disguised Knox's name with that suggests that he was in fact the source. Now it's one thing to say that Knox passed on information that he'd heard from his loose-lipped customers. That doesn't really reflect so much on the man. It's another to say, however, that he betrayed the confidence of his father-in-law. That might not look so honorable. And that gives me an explanation for why Paul Revere kept the name of his informant secret even more than 20 years later. I suspect that a lot of Bostonians could look at what Revere wrote and see the mention of Secretary Flooker and remember who Secretary Flooker's son-in-law was and think about who might be this gentleman who had connections with the Tory party but was a loyalist, but was a Whig at heart. Could be, but they couldn't know for sure. It wasn't that solid in information. Now, I'm not the first to suggest that Henry Knox was revealing information from his father-in-law. Esther Forbes, who wrote Johnny Tremain and Paul Revere and the World He Lived In, she suggested that, among other authors. But I go further in suggesting that Knox's colleagues were impressed by how much he and Lucy gave up when they left their family, her family, and they left Boston in May 1775. The Flookers had to leave America the next year because they were loyalists, but they still enjoyed a very comfortable life in the British Empire. Staying with them seemed like the easy choice for Henry and Lucy. And instead, Henry followed his possibly quiet political conscience and took the risk of joining the rebels. And by that spring, Henry was working with Josiah Waters, Sr. and Jr., father and son, on designing a big fort on Roxbury Hill, which kept the British Army bottled up in Boston. And I believe that people in Massachusetts knew how much Knox had given up, how he had helped the Patriots before the war. I think those things motivated them to recommend him for opportunities, to think that he was trustworthy, to think that he deserved to be rewarded. And he had this meteoric rise in the Continental Army before the end of the year. Starting with no rank at all, he was suddenly made the colonel in charge of the entire artillery regiment by General Washington and the Continental Congress. Now, whether or not the Flookers knew the full extent of Henry's activities, they apparently did feel betrayed. Lucy Knox wrote many letters to her parents and her sister inside Boston and then in Britain, and she never received a reply. There was a real break there. And I think that although Paul Revere and others did not openly talk about Henry Knox and what he'd done, I think that that was part of the family dynamic that explains a lot of how he was treated by his colleagues and how she was treated by her family. For my second story, I'm going to jump to April 1775, 250 years ago next month. In that month, Dr. Joseph Warren was the busiest Patriot leader in Boston. In fact, he was practically the only busy Patriot leader in Boston. Samuel Adams and John Hancock were staying out in Lexington, out of Governor Gage's reach. The other leading Whigs had left town or died or fallen ill. And one of Dr. Warren's major jobs, self-appointed of course, was gathering information about the British Army's plans. Revere's Committee of Mechanics supplied some of that intelligence. He told Belknap, "We frequently took turns, 2 to 2, to watch the soldiers by patrolling the streets at night." But Warren also listened to other people. In 19th century sources mention a groom at the governor's stable, a boy who held horses for redcoat officers, a woman who employed a soldier's wife as a maid, soldiers gossiping about boats and being prepared for some sort of expedition. But at the crucial moment, on April 18th, 1775, Warren reportedly turned to one source of intelligence in particular. That one source we hear about that one source from the same man that Revere talked to, the Reverend Jeremy Belknap, founder of the Massachusetts Historical Society. Back in 1775, however, Jeremy Belknap was a minister in Dover, New Hampshire. And that fall, he visited the troops from his colony who were in the Continental Army camps surrounding Boston, and he kept a diary of that trip. And then a few days after returning to Dover on this October 25th, Belknap added an entry to his travel diary. "Mr. Waters informed me that the design of the regular troops when they marched out to Boston the night of April 18th was discovered to Dr. Warren by a person kept in pay for that purpose. Dr. Warren applied to the person who had been retained and got intelligence of their whole design. 2 expresses were immediately dispatched, and those 2 express riders were William Dawes Jr. and Paul Revere. Despite the fact that Belknap's account from October 1775, quite early, largely fits the known facts, historians have tended to treat it with skepticism, and not for a pretty good reason. How could the minister have come across this inside information about the Boston Patriots intelligence operation when he is 70 miles away in New Hampshire? Who was this Mr. Waters? Why should we believe anything this man had to say? Well, I've already mentioned a Mr. Waters tonight. Remember Josiah Waters, Sr. and Jr., who helped Henry Knox build the fort in Roxbury? Both father and son were officers in the Boston Militia Regiment. They both had jobs in the town government. Josiah Jr. was a member of the Lodge of Freemasons that owned the Green Dragon Tavern. He was also a first cousin of William Dawes. In sum, this Mr. Waters really was closely connected with the people we know were part of the Patriot Network. In 1768, the father, Josiah Waters Sr., invested in land in Maine, becoming the main proprietor of the Massabesic plantation. And that area included the modern towns of Alfred, Sanford, and what the family would modestly term Waterboro. In the fall of 1775, I posit, Josiah Jr. traveled north to Maine to take stock of the family property. The Massabesic plantation sits on the western edge of the District of Maine, and just over the border in New Hampshire was the town of Dover, home of the Reverend Jeremy Belknap. We know from letters after the war that Belknap and Waters became friends. I think that's when they met, or they connected. Belknap was just too smart, as a historian, to spend time writing down a story from a Mr. Waters of what had happened in Boston in April 18th, unless he had good reason to believe that that man was reliable, that he had good information. And Josiah Waters Jr. looks reliable to me. Waters remained active in the Boston militia. By the mid-1780s, he was the colonel of the town regiment. People recalled that he was particularly interested in preserving military lore, recounting stories just like the stories he was told Belknap. And in particular, among the stories that Waters told later in life was an account of how Dr. Warren learned about the British Army mission in April 1775 and sent off messengers. Those stories got passed down and through this operation from one person to another until they were printed in the New England Historic and Genealogical Register in 1853. And according to that account, which of course was probably no longer exactly what Waters said, Waters described the most useful informant about the British march on April 18th this way. An individual by the name of Jasper, an Englishman, a gunsmith by trade, whose shop was on Hatter's Square, he worked for the British, but was friendly to the rebels. A sergeant major quartered in his family and made a confidant of him, telling him all their plans. This Jasper, an Englishman, appears to be the crucial source that Dr. Warren kept in pay and consulted just before sending off Dawes and Revere. Now, in 1775, a sergeant major in the British Army was a regiment senior sergeant. By late on the afternoon of April 18th, a senior sergeant probably knew some important details about the General Gage's big mission. What the troops were supposed to pack, when they would leave Boston, whether they would leave by water or to march over the neck. Those details could indicate which direction the soldiers were headed, how long they would be out there. From that information, Dr. Warren might be able to deduce more. A sergeant would not have known the goal of the march. He would not have known that that expedition was headed for the provincial military supplies in Concord. But Dr. Warren didn't know that either. He sent Dawes and Revere only as far as Lexington. They decided on their own to proceed further west. So, who was this individual by the name of Jasper? That man was almost certainly William Jasper, a maker of cutlery and surgical instruments born in Britain. He wasn't a gunsmith, but as a maker of weapons, he could indeed have worked for the British Army. William Jasper moved to North America soon after the French and Indian War. The first sign of him is an advertisement in the New York Gazette in August 1763, when he was just arrived from England. Jasper then moved to Boston, where he married Anne Newman in June 1768. That couple had children. The family doesn't appear on real estate records, so they were probably just renting space. They weren't very wealthy. Weapons collectors have found William Jasper's name stamped on a couple of blades, possibly made in the late 1700s, such as a spontoon now at the Worcester Art Museum. So, as a native of Britain, subletting space to a British sergeant's family, perhaps doing business with the British military, William Jasper probably appeared reliable enough to the sergeant to share a few details about the upcoming march. But, according to Josiah Waters, Jasper was selling that information to Dr. Warren. And that's not a story we've heard a lot about. We prefer to have stories of people who were motivated to share information because of their political beliefs, not because they were getting money. Jasper, however, did stay in Boston. He remained an American citizen. Now, of course, the royal authorities developed their own sources of information. On Saturday, April 22nd, 3 days after the opening battle of the war, Dr. John Homans, working with the provincial troops outside of Boston, they had too many wounded patients, not enough surgical instruments. The young physician scrawled this plea to his memoir, Dr. Joseph Gardner, inside Boston. Sir, I am engaged under Dr. Warren. We have had many regular soldiers badly wounded, and I have not a knife to use. Would be much obliged to use for a set of knives. I have only time to inform you that we have lost 35 men and killed and wounded and taken between 150 and 200 of theirs. And towards the end of that note, Dr. Homans wrote, I am begging Dr. Church's patience while I scrawl this. Dr. Benjamin Church was going to carry that note into Boston, and he wanted to leave soon. You remember that in his 1798 letter, Paul Revere named 4 patriots he and his committee reported to. 2 of them were Dr. Warren and Dr. Church. In that same letter, Revere recalled the context for Dr. Homans' note, for Church going into Boston. He described a conversation among the patriot leaders one night, a couple of days after the war began. Dr. Church, all at once, started up. Dr. Warren, he says, I am determined to go into Boston tomorrow. It set them all a-staring. Dr. Warren replied, are you serious, Dr. Church? They will hang you if they catch you in Boston. He replied, I am serious, and I am determined to go at all adventures. After a considerable conversation, Dr. Warren said, if you are determined, let us make some business for you. They agreed that he should go get medicine for their and our wounded officers, and he went the next morning. So Dr. Church carried in Dr. Homans' note, but he didn't deliver it to Dr. Gardner. Instead, he turned it over to General Thomas Gage, the British commander. The general thus learned about the rebels' estimate of battle casualties and other information. While Church was in Boston, Rachel Revere gave him a message for her husband, Paul, and 125 pounds to smuggle out of town. That note also went into Gage's files, and we don't know what happened to the money. Church later told his patriot comrades that he was arrested and questioned during that trip, and he was certainly seen at the governor's house before being released and sent back out to the American lines. Everybody thought Dr. Church had made a lucky escape. The Massachusetts Provincial Congress sent him to Philadelphia with important messages for the Continental Congress. And that body was so impressed by Dr. Church that they decided to make him the Surgeon General of the Army, the highest-ranking military doctor. And meanwhile, Dr. Church was still sending messages into Boston, divulging more information about the Continental Forces to General Gage and asking for more money. And Dr. Church wasn't the only spy reporting to General Gage. For instance, on May 2nd, a young man born in Woburn named Benjamin Thompson sent Gage a letter written in invisible ink. This is a letter. It's now visible, so it's not as impressive, but it was invisible ink. Gage treated the paper with a chemical that made Thompson's real message appear. The Patriots didn't really trust Thompson. He gained a reputation after he moved to New Hampshire of being a Tory, but nobody could prove anything against him. Even when the authorities locked him up on suspicion, they had to let him go. So Thompson kept moving around behind the provincial lines, gathering information. So Gage had his own spies out in the Continental ranks, even as they were trying to get to spy on him. So far, I've talked about spies for the royal government and spies for the Patriots. But there are other people watching at the start of the war as well, a couple of Frenchmen. In 1775, the British and French empires were officially at peace, and that meant people from one empire could visit the territories of the other. And interesting. The young Frenchmen, two young Frenchmen were in Massachusetts in early 1775. One of them, whose name runs off the page here because it's so aristocratic, so long, Jean-Julien Alexandre Achard de Bonvalois et Loyauté, whom I'm just going to call Bonvalois. And his companion, whose name is recorded a couple of different ways, but Le Chevalier d'Amboise. Bonvalois was the younger son of a noble French family. In 1775, he was 26 years old, and he appeared older because he walked with a limp. Some people assumed he had been wounded in some way. Other sources say that he had suffered an injury in childhood, or he might have had a congenital disability. In any event, he had limited prospects as a military officer. He had basically gotten an honorary appointment as an officer because if you're born into a rich French family, you're obviously thought to be military material, even if you walked with a limp. In the early 1770s, Bonvalois moved to Saint-Domingue, the island of Haiti, which was immensely profitable as a slave labor plantation. He volunteered for an upscale militia unit, but then in late 1774, early 1775, he decided to visit Britain's mainland colonies, and the Chevalier d'Amboise came along. Naturally, for Frenchmen interested in military affairs, the liveliest part of the British North America in 1775 was New England, where, starting in September 1774, the royal governor and the people were preparing for war. So those two Frenchmen traveled up around the colonies in the summer, and then they sailed to Europe after looking at the war in New England. There weren't any ships going from the British colonies to France, but there were plenty of ships to London. So they sailed to London, where almost immediately, Lord Dartmouth, the Secretary of State for the colonies, started receiving reports about these two Frenchmen who had just arrived from America. Dartmouth's aide, John Pownall, wrote on August 5th, "The lodgers at the hotel in Watling Street have been watched and pumped by a discreet and proper person employed by Lord Rochford." The Earl of Rochford was the other of Britain's secretaries of state who had responsibility for France and southern Europe. And Pownall's letter went on, "They proved to be as stated as the letter you left with me, French officers from the West Indies by the way of North America." As you've guessed, those men were Bonvalois and d'Amboise. And sometime that summer, an informant provided Lord Dartmouth with intelligence, a long memo that said, "I've been able to collect from the two French officers by employing every art and all the address I am master of." That technique included taking a trip to Greenwich together and, quote, "stimulating the pride of Monsieur le Comte de Bonvalois in the moment that some vin de champagne produced the desired effect upon his prudence." In other words, the agent got the young man drunk and flattered him. With his tongue loosened and his pride stimulated, Bonvalois told his agent that they had met Israel Putnam and Artemus Ward, two New England generals. The first they represent to be a good, old-fashioned, civil and brave soldier, but a headstrong, ignorant, and stupid general. And Ward they hold to be very cheap. Bonvalois told the agent they had witnessed the affair at Lexington, which probably meant that they had seen some part of the alarm on April 19th, I think. I don't think they were actually on Lexington Green watching what was going on. They had also somehow witnessed the affair of the 17th, or Bunker Hill. And the Frenchman was quoted as saying, "They were courted by the rebels to stay amongst them, and they were offered 40 pounds a month each of pay. They did not think that such offers solid, nor did they like the paper currency." The two men had visited the provincial fortifications in Roxbury and Cambridge, and also the Park of Artillery in Cambridge. Bonvalois said those guns were fine, carriages were bad. D'Amboise held that the artillery artillery was rather cheap in general, and particularly the mortars. But both agreed that the rebels were in want of ammunition. The Frenchmen even claimed that the rebel chiefs employed every art to keep up the common people's spirit, such as making their own people put on English regimentals and come into the camp in the character of officers and soldiers deserting from His Majesty's troops. And one man personated a member of Parliament. Now, I cannot find any hint of those things happening in New England. Nobody wrote down, oh, today I saw a member of Parliament. I think they were, Bon Voulois and d'Amboise were probably telling their British questioner things they thought the British wanted to hear, things that made them feel more important. But the Frenchmen weren't just talking to the British government. Pownall told Lord Dartmouth on August 5th, a few days ago, the society at the hotel was increased by the addition of a French officer from France, who got out of his chaise at Westminster Bridge, took a hackney coach, and went both to the Spanish and French ambassadors. So we can imagine, the French agents watching the Frenchmen getting out, the British agents watching the Frenchman's hotel, following one man's car as he changes vehicles to try to disguise his whereabouts. He finally got to the Duc de Guines, France's ambassador to Great Britain in 1775. And while enjoying that champagne, Bon Voulois had told his contact that he had 2 audiences with the de Guines, that His Excellency had made him great offers of service and asked him twice to dinner. Bon Voulois and the agent concluded, my opinion is that these 2 French officers are at this instant in the service of the rebel Americans, and they're paid by them. That they either came over with proposals to the courts of France or Spain or some other commission in the American interests. So now we have a British secret agent believing that these Frenchmen were actually American secret agents. That wasn't accurate. But Bon Voulois did have ambitions, which we'll get back to. Thus, in the spring of 1775, the army around Boston was filled with spies, observers, people out for their own advantage, people looking for information that they could sell or use for their own careers or use for their side. And into that morass stepped a complete stranger, the Virginia planter George Washington. With his experience in the French and Indian War, with his reading, he knew that intelligence was crucial for military operations, but he didn't know in New England. He didn't know these people. Neither did the handful of aides and generals he brought with him. General Washington was stepping into a game that was already underway, and he had to rely on what the locals told him, who they said that he could trust. And within 2 weeks of his arrival, he stepped into the spy game. On July 15th, the general recorded paying 100 British pounds given to blank to induce him to go into the town of Boston to establish a secret correspondence for the purpose of conveying intelligence of the enemy's movements and designs. That is the single largest expenditure Washington made when he first arrived in Cambridge. Who got that 100 pounds? Well, Washington was careful not to put the man's name in his expense notebook. Instead, he wrote this footnote: the names of persons who are employed within the enemy lines or who may fall within their power cannot be inserted. John C. Fitzpatrick, who edited Washington's papers in the 1930s, praised the general's sense of secrecy, pointing out another example. Later in the war, Major Benjamin Talmadge was placed in charge of the Secret Service, and in the Washington papers is a letter from him in which he incautiously mentioned the name of one of his spies. It has been so heavily scored over by the pen of the commander-in-chief as to defy deciphering, and Washington's answer to Talmadge's letter contains a sharp rebuke to the major for having needlessly exposed the spy to such a risk of discovery. But that example came from later in the war. In July 1775, Washington's subordinates weren't so careful, and that leaves us evidence. On July 28th, the general's military secretary, Joseph Reed, sent a letter to Lieutenant Colonel Loammi Baldwin, who was commanding a Massachusetts regiment in Chelsea. Reed was from Philadelphia, so he was as new to New England as Washington was. Baldwin, in contrast, was a farmer and builder from an old Woburn family. His regiment's colonel was in disgrace, so he had basically been put in charge of the north side of the Boston Harbor. And in particular, Baldwin oversaw the landing place of the Winnissimette Ferry, which was one of the few ways that people or messages could get in, on, and off of the two peninsulas now held by the British Army, Boston and Charlestown. And this is what Reed wrote to Baldwin on July 28th. In full confidence of your prudence and secrecy as a soldier, a man of honor, and a friend to his country, the general has directed me to communicate to you a scheme that he is about to put into execution to obtain constant and authentic intelligence from Boston. The plan is this. The enclosed letter will be delivered by you to one Duxbury, who lives about 4 miles from you towards Shirley Point. He will deliver it to a waterman, whom he can depend on, who will convey it to one John Carnes, a grocer, in the south part of Boston. The answers and such intelligence as he can procure will be forwarded to you through the same channel, which you are to transmit to His Excellency by express immediately. Reed told Baldwin to destroy this letter as soon as you are sufficiently master of his comments. But Baldwin didn't do that. That's why we know what he wrote. He saved it for us. Baldwin did indeed pass on the enclosed letter to the man named Duxbury, who lived about 4 miles away on Shirley Point. That's how Reed understood those names. Duxbury was actually Tewksbury, Shirley Point, Point Shirley. One of those men gave the letter to the waterman. The watermen handled small boats in the harbor carrying goods and people, and we know from other letters that they were good conduits for information and smuggled goods into and out of Boston. So some waterman ferried that letter into John Carnes, a grocer. John Carnes, I think, was therefore the most likely the man who had taken the 100 pounds from Washington on July 15th to go into Boston for the purpose of conveying intelligence of the enemy's movements and designs. But who was John Carnes? Back in 1770, a man named John Carnes published an essay in the Boston Gazette which described himself as working in the grocery way. So this was John Carnes, a grocer. Carnes came from the upper class of Boston, so his life is fairly well documented. He was born in 1723, son of a man who ran a pewter workshop. He graduated from Harvard in 1742, and he went into the ministry 4 years later. So he was the Reverend John Carnes. Unfortunately, he was not a successful reverend. He was a minister in Stoneham for 13 years before resigning in a dispute over pay, or the lack of it. He then became minister at Seekonk and quickly found himself in trouble with members there for whatever reason. Other ministers tried to mediate this dispute. Even the Massachusetts legislature got involved. Everyone agreed that Mr. Carnes was not at fault, but he couldn't win. He just couldn't convince this congregation to keep him, so he resigned. He obviously lacked the commanding presence that a lot of New England ministers had. In the 1760s, Carnes gave up the pulpit and moved his family, because at this point he had a wife and growing children to support. He moved them into Boston and he went into the grocery business. He opened a shop on Orange Street in the South End, and he kept a low profile politically, which probably made it possible for him to re-enter the besieged town without arousing too much suspicion. On August 15th, Colonel Baldwin told Washington that a letter from Mr. J.C., the grocer, was on its way. And the next day, one of the Tewksbury brothers brought it to headquarters. And 5 days later, only 5 days later, a man named Ezekiel Price, an insurance broker and court official who had left Boston and was living in Milton, wrote in his diary about such a letter. Mr. Hill of Providence was here, who left Cambridge this forenoon, and said that this morning a woman got out of Boston who brought a letter from Parson Carnes, which mentioned that the regulars in Boston intended to come out this night or tomorrow night, in consequence of which preparations were making on several American encampments to receive them. And indeed, we know from General Washington's orders that he had the soldiers on Prospect Hill and Winter Hill to be ready for an attack that night. So he was acting on this intelligence. In addition to that evidence from 1775 about John Carnes, we also have a family tradition, first published in 1898, that Carnes, quote, lived in Boston during the siege and corresponded with General Washington. But obviously, Carnes's intelligence gathering didn't stay secret. As the Ezekiel Price diary shows, Soon after he started sending out reports to General Washington, people were talking about the news all over the American lines with his name attached. News like that could have gotten back into Boston on October 26th. Less than a week later, a royal official in Newport sent General Gage intelligence of much importance to you from the rebel camp. And in fact, anyone who knows anything about intelligence knows that Washington's secretary, Joseph Reed, made some very elementary errors in managing spies. This is the first time he was doing it. Let's look back on his letter to Baldwin. First, the letter provides no evidence that either Reed or Washington had checked on Baldwin before giving him this very sensitive assignment. Second, Baldwin's task was simply to pass a letter to Mr. Tewksbury and later to send along any messages that came back. He didn't need to know the name of the agent in Boston. He didn't need to know the route. But Reed told Baldwin that crucial information and in writing, and Baldwin kept it. Reed told Baldwin, "Let it not escape you to the nearest friend on earth." He didn't know that Loamese Baldwin's nearest friend on earth was Benjamin Thompson, the man with the invisible ink. Baldwin continued to view Thompson as a dear friend until he died. It wasn't until scholars studied that invisible ink letter in the early 1900s that they realized that Thompson had been working as a spy in early 1775. One obvious question is, why did General Gage just kick Carnes out of Boston instead of arresting him as a spy? And I suspect that the governor really had no idea that Carnes had met with Washington before coming into Boston and taken money. He thought Carnes had sent out a private letter to a family, and it just happened to contain sensitive information, and well, we can't have that get away. I also suspect that Carnes's lack of commanding charisma worked in his favor. When Carnes died, the Reverend William Bentley of Salem wrote, "His talents were small, and his manners displeasing, but his simplicity had no vice in it. We used often to laugh at Carnes, but there was many a worse man in our wicked world." And it looks to me like John Carnes came across as just so ineffectual that no one, not even the British commanders, not American historians, could believe that he was a spy. His cover story held up for more than 200 years. Sometimes Washington just got lucky in his search for intelligence. Here's another example. In July 1775, he was trying to obtain good maps of the British fortifications of Boston. On July 27th, Lieutenant Richard Williams of His Majesty's 23rd Regiment wrote in his diary, "Last night Thomas Matchin, soldier in our regiment, deserted when sentry on the fireboat in the river near the Neck. He went off in the canoe. He took the other man's firelock musket with him, as it was that man's turn to lie down. This fellow will give them good intelligence of our works, for he was a pretty good mechanic and knew a little of fortification. He invented a new carriage for guns on pivot, etc." We have General Washington's notes on his conversation with this man, who also reported on how many soldiers the British had lost at Bunker Hill. And other diaries from the time also mention this unusually clever deserter. The meeting with Washington may not have gone entirely smoothly. On July 27th, the next day, the general orders to the whole Continental Army said, "For the future, when any deserters come out to any of our outguards, they are without the least delay to be sent to the Major General commanding that division of the Army. Some deserters being made drunk, who came out last night from the enemy before they reached headquarters, it will be considered as a breach of orders for any person who gives rum to deserters before they are examined by the general." But in any case, Washington put Thomas Matchin to work drawing detailed plans of the British fortifications. In January, Matchin was working as a quartermaster for the Quartermaster General. He probably acted as a scout during a continental raid on a British position in Charlestown. And finally, on January 18th, General Washington gave Thomas Matchin a commission as a lieutenant in the American Artillery Force. Now, in the British Army, Matchin had very little chance to become an officer because he hadn't been born into the genteel ranks. Even though his commanders recognized him as smart, the highest he could probably go was sergeant. By defecting to the American side, Matchin had found more opportunity. He served in the Continental Army for most of the war, rising to the rank of captain. And he is remembered for having designed and supervised the manufacture of the chain across the Hudson River, starting in 1776. This was a way of keeping the British fleet from sailing up the Hudson. It was a series of floating platforms chained together. And Thomas Matchin, who had started the war as a private in the British Army, was the man who created that. My next spy for General Washington to deal with is someone mentioned in many histories of American espionage, but usually without the name. I uncovered that name about 10 years ago. Mary Butler came from Marblehead, Massachusetts, and she moved to Newport, Rhode Island, and in January 1765, she married a man named Godfrey Wenwood. He was an immigrant from Prussia, born about 1739. He arrived in Rhode Island from London in December 1764, according to this newspaper advertisement from the Newport Mercury, and he was a baker. The Rhode Island legislature naturalized Wenwood in 1772. And in 1774, the Wenwoods' marriage fell apart. That August, Godfrey placed this ad in the Newport newspaper saying that his wife Mary had deserted him and he was no longer responsible for any debts she might incur. This was a standard 18th century prelude to a divorce. In September 1774, Godfrey Wenwood petitioned the Newport Superior Court to dissolve his marriage, saying Mary had committed adultery and cohabited with other men. This is the writ for the sheriff to summon Mary Wenwood to court to tell her side, and on the back is the sheriff's note saying that he couldn't find her anywhere in Newport. Later that month, the court granted Godfrey Wenwood an uncontested divorce. But that wasn't the end of the story. The baker still had grievances, and in January 1775, he paid for this ad in the Boston Post-Boy. "Stop thief, whereas a certain pretended lady, now known and called by the name of Mary Wenwood, formerly called Mary Butler, a native of Marblehead, a very lusty woman, much pitted with the smallpox, who generally wears the best of clothing, did some time past take, steal, and carry away from my dwelling house in Newport a woman's red broadcloth coat and sundry other articles. I do hereby offer a reward of the sum of $12 to any person or persons who will apprehend the said Mary." This ad shows us a few things. First, it gives us a picture, a very biased picture, of Mary Wenwood. Second, it tells us that in early 1775, Godfrey Wenwood had reason to believe that his former wife was in the Boston area. He put this in a Boston newspaper, not in any Rhode Island newspaper, or in any Essex County newspaper where she had come from. And third, it suggests that the Wenwoods, even after their divorce, were still in touch. They weren't getting along, but they were still connected somehow. And indeed, in July 1775, after the war began, Mary Wenwood came to Newport and brought her ex-husband a letter and asked him to pass it on to the royal authorities in town so they could send it into Boston to an army officer. Godfrey Wenwood, the baker, he got suspicious. He opened the letter, and he saw that it was written in cipher, which made him even more suspicious. So he sat on it for several weeks. And in September, Mary wrote to him asking, why hadn't you sent the letter on? Which made him so suspicious that finally, after 2 months, he went to the authorities with this letter. They sent him to General Nathaniel Greene, commander of the Rhode Island troops at the siege. Greene brought Godfrey Wenwood to General Washington in Cambridge on September 29th. After Washington heard the story, he asked the baker to visit his ex-wife and weasel out of her the name of whoever had given her that letter. Godfrey went across the Charles River to what's now Alston Brighton, where Mary Wenwood was living. He talked with her, no success. So Washington ordered his men to detain Mary Wenwood. According to James Warren, she was brought to the general's quarters that night. It was not until the next day that anything could be got from her. Washington himself said for a long time she was proof against every threat and persuasion. But finally, she gave up the name of the man who had given her that letter. That was her current lover, who had left his wife for her and was setting her up at this house in Alston Brighton, and that was Dr. Benjamin Church, Jr. As Surgeon General of the Army, Dr. Church had been supervising the hospitals from the Penelope Vassal House very near Washington's headquarters, like half a block away. And now the commander had, pretty much by luck, detected Church sending a secret letter to an officer of the Royal Army inside Boston. General Washington summoned Dr. Church to his headquarters. The doctor arrived and admitted that the letter was his, but he said it was an innocent message for his brother-in-law. The general asked for the key to the cipher. The doctor said he didn't know where it was anymore. Washington ordered Church confined to his quarters in the Penelope Vassal house, and he asked around for someone who could decode the letter. And word came back that the Reverend Samuel West of Dartmouth, Massachusetts, an Army chaplain, was good with codes. West was known across Massachusetts for both his intellect and his absent-mindedness. And the general sent him a copy of the letter, and he turned out that Dr. Church had used a simple substitution cipher, one letter for one symbol. So West could figure out the most common symbols, try the most common letters, look for common letter patterns, and even with the variability of 18th century spelling, it didn't take West long to discover the message. The letter showed Washington that Church had tried several different ways to get messages into Boston. It also contained a lot of information about the American troop strength, about supplies, about support from neighboring colonies, about morale. On the other hand, some of that information wasn't particularly secret. Furthermore, Dr. Church had overstated the number of soldiers, the gunpowder supply, and other sensitive facts. He insisted that he was simply trying to impress the enemy with a strong idea of our strength and situation in order to prevent an attack at a time when the Continental Army was in great want of ammunition, and in hopes of effecting some speedy accommodation of the present dispute. Well, on October 3rd, Washington assembled all of his generals for a council of war. They examined the ciphered letter and the translation. They called in Dr. Church and questioned him, and the generals unanimously agreed on two things. First, that Dr. Church had carried on a criminal correspondence with the enemy. And second, that under the Congress's Articles of War, they couldn't do much about it. The military laws made holding correspondence with or giving intelligence to the enemy a crime, but it did not say that this was a serious crime that demanded capital punishment or great imprisonment. A court-martial could not sentence Dr. Church to no more than 39 lashes, a fine not exceeding 2 months of pay, or imprisonment not exceeding 1 month. This was a bureaucratic error. It reflected how Patriot leaders hadn't thought clearly about the danger of treachery from within their own ranks. They were suspicious of outsiders, suspicious of anyone who had a royal appointment, but they hadn't grappled with the possibility of that a leading patriot could become a spy for the enemy. And in fact, not until General Gage's files became available in the early 1900s did historians realize that Dr. Church had been spying for the British as early as February 1775, and had turned over very sensitive information. Washington never knew the full extent of Church's treachery. Nevertheless, the discovery of the doctor's secret correspondence appears to have been a major lesson for Washington. It alerted him to the danger of spies within his own army, within his own networks, in fact. Indeed, let's think back to that letter that Joseph Reed had sent to Loammi Baldwin to be passed on through several hands into Boston and John Carnes. That letter came from Dr. Benjamin Church. As soon as Mary Wenwood revealed who had given her that secret ciphered letter, Washington and Reed must have realized that the possibility that their little spy ring had been infiltrated by the enemy from the start. Church could have given away Carnes at any moment. It cost the minister his life. But the doctor was just more interested in getting money from General Gage. After Dr. Church's arrest in October 1775, there was far less documentation about intelligence activity coming out of Washington's headquarters. The general and his staff stopped writing down so much secret information. They stopped saving sensitive papers. At the end of the siege, Washington recorded more expenses for secret services to this date. Over 232 pounds. This is the largest single item during his entire time in Massachusetts. But this time, he wrote nothing in his notebook about how many people he'd paid or for what tasks. It's just a lump sum. The line refers to a memorandum with details which they destroyed. In the first months of the war, the commander and his staff and the Congress all made some basic mistakes in managing intelligence and counterintelligence. They underestimated the enemy they were facing. They underestimated the possibility of traitors in their own ranks. But those mistakes in 1775 made Washington a real spy master. Here's one last story about General Washington dealing with espionage. In early October 1775, shortly after Dr. Church's treachery was discovered, a man wrote from Newport to say that the Earl of Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, had been scheming with a colonial major named John Connolly. Washington arranged for Cowley, the man in Newport, to come to Cambridge and divulge all he knew. Cowley described Connolly's plan to go into the Indian country to raise Indians and French to fight for the crown. The commander immediately sent that intelligence to the Congress in Philadelphia, who tried to hunt for Connolly in the back country. And by the end of November, Connolly and 2 associates were in jail in Maryland. Then in December, General Washington received more intelligence on this case. Captain John Manley here had captured a sloop sailing from Virginia to Boston with food for the besieged garrison. And there were some loyalists on board as well who were trying to join the British forces. One of those loyalists was a 15-year-old named John Skye Eustace. He was carrying a letter of recommendation from Lord Dunmore to General William Howe in Boston. Dunmore wrote, "He is a very good scholar, Latin scholar, of exceeding good spirit and quick parts, of excellent temper and good disposition, has conceived a great desire to go into the army. I have therefore to entreat you when an opportunity arises to give him a commission. The only fault I know in him, if fault it can be called in a boy, is that he is a little too volatile." Washington almost certainly knew of young John Eustace back in Virginia. The boy had arrived in Williamsburg with Lord Dunmore in 1771, and the governor had paid for his education at the College of William and Mary. The reason for Lord Dunmore's generosity, gossip said, was that the Earl had taken John's older sister, Kitty, as his mistress. Washington let some of the captives off the Betsy, the captured ship, go home to Virginia, but young John Eustace decided not to go. Instead, he joined the rebel forces. And he showed his new loyalty to the Continental cause by spilling Lord Dunmore's secrets about Major John Connolly. In January 1776, General Washington wrote to the Congress, "You may rely that Connolly had instructions concealed in his saddle. Mr. Eustace, who was one of Lord Dunmore's family, saw that the instructions were artfully concealed in the 2 pieces of wood which are in the mail pellion of his portmanteau saddle. That by order of Lord Dunmore he saw them contrived for the purpose, the papers put in, the first covered over with tin and with a waxed canvas cloth. He is so exceedingly pointed and clear in his information that I have no doubt of its being true." So you can just imagine this 15-year-old trying to explain to George Washington, they put the thing with the tin, the canvas cloth. Of all the espionage and intelligence activity in the first year of the Revolutionary War, that was a minor one. It's a 15-year-old kid. It was important to him. It turned out not to have a lot of consequence. Connolly was already in jail. But one of the people I've talked about was actually very influential, and that was Bonvlouis, Jean Alexandre Archard de Bonvlouis. We left that young man in London in August 1775 being watched by British agents. And he was also in touch with the French ambassador, the Duc de Guines, who answered to the French foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes. Vergennes sent a letter authorizing Bonvlouis to return to America as an unofficial French envoy. De Guines gave Bonvlouis money from the French government, but ordered him not to state that he was an official government agent, not to make any promises to the Americans. Bonvlouis sailed from London to Philadelphia in the fall of 1775. His cover story was now that he was a merchant from Antwerp in the Austrian Netherlands, or what we now call Belgium. Bonvlouis arrived in Philadelphia toward the end of November. He contacted a Frenchman named Francis Damon, who was tending the library in Carpenter's Hall. Damon contacted one of the men he was tutoring in the French language, a man named Benjamin Franklin. Franklin was a delegate to the Continental Congress, recently assigned to the Committee of Secret Correspondence, which was later renamed the Committee of Foreign Affairs. In December 1775, Franklin and two other members of that committee, Thomas Jefferson and John Jay, met 3 times with Bonvouloir in the Carpenter's Hall, with Damon serving as translator. John Jay described this meeting many years later. The Frenchmen assured the Americans that King Louis XVI wished them success and would, whenever it should be necessary, manifest more openly his friendly sentiments towards them. The committee asked to know what authority he was speaking under. Bonvouloir drew his hand across his throat. Gentlemen, I shall take care of my head. The gentleman then asked how the French might show its support. If you want arms, said Bonvouloir, you shall have them. If you want ammunition, you shall have it. If you want money, you shall have it. The committee were pleased. They asked again, by what authority was this young man speaking? Gentlemen, I shall take care of my head. And that's how those meetings in December 1775 ended. But that was enough for the Congress to send Silas Deane of Connecticut over to France in 1776 as the first ambassador. And then later they sent Franklin and they sent Arthur Lee and they sent eventually Thomas Jefferson. That was the seed of the Franco-American alliance that eventually led to victory in the war and to independence. And it all started with a Frenchman visiting New England to see what he could see and then deciding to get involved in the world of international espionage. Thank you very much. Now, okay, let's go back. The questions answered. Here's your instructions. And those are the people I talked about. Does anyone have any questions? Yes, sir.
Hi, you have a lot of maps in there, and we think these days, at least I do, from the movies and all about map use by spies and all. And I've seen a replica of the map that British spies brought back from Concord. Can you tell me about use of maps by provincials in spying?
Who about provincials? Okay. Well, indeed, this is a part of the story of, in my book, The Road to Concord, that 2 British officers were sent out into the countryside named Henry de Bernier and William Brown. And it looks like Henry de Bernier, while he was out there, drew this map, which is now in the collection of the Library of Congress, and at a recent event in Concord, the National Park Service had reproduced this map at its original size. I'd never seen it that large, and we're using it as a instructional aid. And that is when you say maps and spies, that's the first thing that I come up with. De Bernier was a very well-trained military officer. He was pretty young, but he also had artistic skills. So it's much easier to remember, to think of examples from the British side. For the American side, I do remember that the chief engineer of the British Army, Montresor, Captain John Montresor, complained that some of his maps were stolen from General Gage and used by the Americans. The most famous of these maps was actually a map that he drew of the route through Maine, and supposedly Benedict Arnold used in his travels through Maine in the fall of 1775 to get up to Quebec and help attack that city. However, Montresor had intentionally crippled this map. He had drawn misinformation. He had made the distances seem much shorter, so that if Arnold was in fact using a stolen map, and there's really no clear evidence that he was, but if he was, he thought the trip up to Quebec was a lot shorter than it actually was, which may explain why it was a lot harder than he actually expected. Those are the maps that I can remember, and those were British Army maps. So I'm at a loss to think of an American Army map off the top of my head. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
You mentioned Benedict Arnold, and I was wondering maybe from your talk, but now I'm thinking about maybe it's better to characterize him as a traitor rather than a spy, or?
Oh, he was a spy as well. It's just that he wasn't a spy yet. He got to be a spy later in the war because he had soured on not getting the promotions he wanted, being accused by Joseph Reed, who comes up in this story as Washington's military secretary, but then went back to Pennsylvania and was a politician there. Reed accused Arnold of basically embezzling. And so that and a marriage to a young woman who was from a Loyalist family turned Benedict Arnold so that later, around 1780, he became the arch traitor. If he hadn't done so, probably Dr. Benjamin Church Jr. would be our term for a traitor, the same way we use Benedict Arnold to mean a traitor in American culture, and everybody knows what that means. Benjamin Church's treachery, when it came out in the fall of 1775, was just as flabbergasting to the Massachusetts Patriots, who had been working with him for years and trusted him. Everybody was extremely surprised. People, Samuel Adams, John Adams, so on. The people who weren't surprised were their wives, because he had this reputation of having affairs. That had gone back for years. So you can see the letters from the husbands are all saying, "Can you believe this about Church? Can it be true?" And the wives are saying, "Well, we knew that, didn't we?" Yes, ma'am.
When did Henry Knox take the cannons from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston? And at that point, wasn't it clear what his allegiance was?
Yes, it was, but that was some months after it. The war started April 1775. It looks like he got out of Boston in May 1775, so that was the break with his family. In July, he met George Washington for the first time. Washington had just arrived and was inspecting the various fortifications around Boston, and he saw the fort in Roxbury, and he was impressed by it. And Knox writes this very proud letter to his wife, to Lucy, saying, I impressed General Washington today. And over time, they became friends, and meanwhile, Washington was realizing that the man in charge of the American artillery, a man named Colonel Richard Gridley, was no longer up to the job. And he wanted to replace Gridley with Washington. The problem was that Gridley was a 60-something hero of the previous war. He was highly respected. He had been given a British pension. Everybody thought he was brilliant. And Washington wanted to replace him with a 20-something bookseller who had never been in war before and was not even a member of the Continental Army yet. And that was a really tough political assignment, and it took a lot of maneuvering to get that through. But in the fall of 1775, Washington was able to kick Gridley upstairs, say, "You're now the chief engineer of the Continental Army," put Knox in charge of the artillery regiment, and his first assignment was to go to New York and collect more heavy cannon for the siege lines around Boston. And that's the first mission we remember Henry Knox for. And I argue that, in fact, what he was doing, providing information before the war, was what caused people to believe that he was trustworthy enough to have such a high commission, and that he deserved, for all that he had given up, some sort of recognition from the Continental Army. And of course, Knox went on to be head of the Continental Army, Continental Artillery, a general, eventually the Secretary of War under the Congress, and then under General Washington. He also, although his family broke with the Flookers, his in-laws, he managed to maneuver into inheriting a great deal of the Flooker land up in Maine. And so after the war, he was a real land baron up in that area based on Lucy's inheritance or claim. In the back, sir. Yes, sir.
Sir, would you expand on the British Army practice of quartering their troops on the civilian population in Boston?
Okay.
I imagine that would make it difficult to keep a secret.
Well, yes, although we have misconceptions in our culture of what quartering was. It was not taking a couple of soldiers and sticking them in somebody's house and saying, you have to look after these men. That would be a way to lose your soldiers, because you wanted to keep all your privates together. You wanted to keep them under the control of the sergeant. Quartering really meant, and there's a good recent book about this, named Quartering, was really a sort of tax on the community. The community was responsible for building barracks, maintaining them, supplying certain commodities like firewood. That's what the law said. So when there were complaints, when there were disputes within the within New York in the 1760s, Boston in 1768, and then 1774, over soldiers' quarters. That really meant that the community did not want to give up resources for barracks. At the same time, some soldiers traveled with their wives and children, and they would rent space in willing people's houses. British officers also, especially since they were gentlemen and they had money, they would rent rooms in people's houses. So there were people attached to the army renting rooms from private citizens, always willing private citizens. And in some cases, like William Jasper, they might have had a special motivation or developed a special motivation to rent rooms to a British sergeant and his family. So this was a possible security issue, but because they were not forcing any family to take in these borders, it was, I believe the authorities assumed that anyone who would willingly rent quarters to a British officer was a good security risk.